Hello YouTube, it is your boy Dave, come back with another video, and for today, I kind of just wanted to talk about Super Granny, and more specifically, casual games, because they intrigue me, and because, in my opinion, I've had a sort of obsession with casual games, especially early 2000s ones, since I was a kid, and I've always kind of just enjoyed them in the fact that no one talks about them. You know, I kind of enjoy the fact that they are just sort of this little hole that you can find yourself in and being like, wow, it's like a cave. It's like a cave of goddamn early 2000s PC games. I would say, honestly, at least in my eyes, I consider them pre-internet, even though the internet existed when these games existed. I mean, shit, the games have high score tables and all that, specifically so you can see other people's scores that were from the online. But even with that, I consider them pre-internet because, you know, when I had a computer at that time, I didn't have internet. You know? So I would have to get emulators and ROMs and all that from, like, the library. I'd have to go to the library, download shit there, and then come back and then, you know, use them and all that. You know, we only got internet a few years later, so games like this I think of as internet, like games that you didn't need internet to play, which is funny because my computer doesn't have internet as I talk about this. You know, so I guess it makes sense. But in my opinion, games like this are kind of a nightmare to discuss. You know, aside from nostalgically thinking about them in the past, aside from just discussing about them in a sense, you know, discussing the ways in which they kind of existed, right? Like you can talk about how back in the day they were all like, oh yeah, you know, how the differences between now and then were. But discussing the games in general is kind of a nightmare, and I'll get to why, you know. Firstly, you really got to think about when the games came out. These games came out, let's say, 2001. Back then, games like this weren't really made to be powerhouse games. They were mostly made so that way anybody that was using one of those standard Dell computers, you know, the ones you'd see in schools during the early 2000s till late 2010s, you know, had. These are the kinds of games you could pretty much run on anything, so long as it was a computer, and so long as it probably had a pulse. Like that's the best thing about it, is even like this little, I have a little old Windows XP computer. I tried running it on and it worked fine. And that's sort of the thing, is games like this are basically meant to run on fucking anything. It's not like Doom, how people have tried to run it on anything, but it's Doom enough in the sense that you can run it on practically anything. Shit, you can run it. I'm currently using Windows 10 and it still runs perfectly, which is nice. Because I would hate to see this game be like, oh yeah, you need to do this patch, or you gotta do this, or you gotta do that. Truth be told, the game's too simple for that. But that's the problem I have with a game like Super Granny. I love this game to death. I love everything about it. On an aesthetic level, the music, the gameplay, just how everything just looks so dinky, but, you know, has its charm. It's the biggest problem with discussing a game like this is the fact that there's virtually nothing really to discuss, you know? It knows what it is, it basically knows what it wants to be. It doesn't try to do anything outside of that, so it makes discussing it very difficult. You know, you look at a game like, oh, I don't know, a game like Persona, or you look at a game like Undertale, or you look at a game like Fallout, and there's depth. There's a lot of things to discuss because there's a lot of nuance and subtlety, and, you know, a shit ton of writing, story. You know, and not every game needs to be filled with story. I mean, look at how I discussed like Evolution Skateboarding and how even the gameplay itself has enough to discuss on its own. You know, a game doesn't need to be weird to be interesting. It just has to have something to really discuss and grasp onto. Games like this, games that I feel like have been put into like the casual market, are kind of games that are a nightmare to discuss because oftentimes there's not enough to discuss in general. You know, that's why I think even a channel like fucking CGR or LGR or anybody hasn't talked about games like this because they sit in such a weird position of being that sort of casual game. You know, these aren't the kind of games you discuss. These are the kinds of games you look back on nostalgically in a few years and then say, yeah, that game was great, only to never think about it again because, once again, you're probably playing something else. You're probably playing a game like Dying Light or, you know, Fallout New Vegas or whatever the fuck you're playing. You know, these aren't really the games that time has really like benefited. These are the kinds of games that are sort of meant to be forgotten to a certain extent. And, you know, for me, it's a damn shame because it's just like, these games deserve some love. These games deserve to be acknowledged. And, I found this game specifically off an old CD, off Internet Archive. I'll probably send a link to it in the video description. So if any of you guys want to try playing Super Granny or, whatever else, be my guest, because I'd be happy to see people start playing this again and start discussing it, or just playing in general, because once again, discussing a game like this is very difficult because there's not really much to discuss. The game is bright and colorful, it's nice and happy and all that, and maybe that's the problem, right? When a game is like dark and depressing, there's more nuance and there's more texture to it, and maybe that's what Anthony Fantano was talking about when he was talking about like music. And this is kind of like a weird tangent to go off of, but I remember, I didn't even know you could do that. What the hell? I remember in one Anthony Fantano video, he basically was saying, like, or in one PBS video that was talking about how Anthony Fantano reviews music, and one thing that they realized is that the music has to have come from, like, a sad place, or it has to come from a very emotional place. And I realized games like this are basically, like, they're joyful, they're happy, they're, like, optimistic, they're like, yeah, look, you just save the cats. It's like, okay, it's straightforward and it's wholesome, but it's like, there's nothing really much above that, right? There's not like you're fighting, like, an apocalypse or whatever, fighting Satan. No, it's just little grandma. It's like, is that bad? No. But when it comes to, like, reviews and all that, you sort of need, like, conflict. You sort of need something to really give you an excuse to talk about it. Otherwise, you're just talking about nothing. You're just basically just having a short-ass video that's just, yeah, it's good. Which I could do. I could have just made the video 5 seconds and said, yeah, that's it. But no. I actually want to talk about this game in a way that no one else has actively tried, because, to be honest, it is a game that's very difficult, because, once again, although there is mechanics that are ever-changing, like little elevators, or bombs, or like plants and all that, it's not a game that I would say has enough depth to really be easy to discuss. In fact, it's very difficult, because, like I said, it's a casual game, and so because of that, there's not enough depth. There's a story, like, grandma's on vacation, but oh no, an evil doctor has decided on stealing all the cats, so you gotta save the cats. And it's like, it's a simple little story, like one of those ones that's probably would fit in the inside of a very small piece of paper, so it's just like, alright, as grandma, you gotta save the cats. That's it. It's like, okay. I feel like it's weird, though, like, on an unrelated note, why there's so many games that are just like grandma on, like, app stores and all that, but there's no Super Granny at all. And then I feel like that's kind of weird. Maybe the company that made this went bankrupt, who knows. But I feel like that's sort of the issue with discussing games like this, is just there's just not enough meat to really be had. So why puzzle games aren't discussed as much unless they're thoroughly weird. That's why I feel like you'll see guys like, your Joseph Andersons or whatever, like your people that make really long-form content will talk about games that are oftentimes the most flawed or have some sort of, like, introspective kind of ways of thinking about it, right? Like, a lot of people that do reviews and all that, they look for games that are inherently flawed or are really good, right? Like your Breath of the Wilds or your Extreme Paint Brawls. Games like this are oftentimes the games that are looked back on with some appeasement, some enjoyment, but oftentimes aren't discussed in the same ways, because I feel like they're sort of looked down on, It's sort of the idea that, games like this, they're too casual to really, to be discussed. And it's like, I get it, but I don't know, I guess in my eyes, I'm just intrigued by the ways that games like this can exist, and yet no one makes a review for it. I guess even in this day and age, I guess no one is willing to make reviews for it, and I get it, There is videos and there is games that are pretty much unreviewable to a certain extent. The ones that are just so weirdly cryptic and are basically kind of partially lost media to a certain extent. Like there are games that people won't make full videos on, like advert games, or like, well, I mean, Chex Quest is an advertising game, but I would say at least with that, there's at least there's enough depth for it. You know, I guess that's all that really matters, right? Like if the game has depth, or if the game has enough substance to really be discussed. Because otherwise, you're sort of left in a situation where you're playing a game where you can't really discuss it all that much.